Hello everyone, it's Chocolate here. This is the promised CB preview video. As you can see, I am on the CN server mega sheet, which collects all the publicly known comps and timelines from their past CBs. This one goes all the way up to CB24, after which they switch to their own dedicated website, which is over here, and I'll link both of those in the description. So I'm going to go phase 1 to 3, and for each one, boss 1 to 5. There are some differences between CN and Global, which means we can't copy 1 to 1, which isn't too bad this time. However, for some stuff like the Goblin, it's pretty unfortunate. We get the unnerfed version, which is basically what we've had so far. But for this CB, it was supposed to go down to a version with a lower UB level, which means less damage against the tank and less PDEF buff from the UB itself. Effectively, this comp right here with XChika and Yukari doesn't work. Like, we can't one-shot C1 with mages anymore, which is very unfortunate because I worked a lot on this comp to make sure it's properly usable. But yeah, let's start from the beginning and I'll go into differences when they come up. So as you can see, for A1 we have one comp that will look very familiar after we go through phase 1 and 2, which is the main physical comp with both XChika, XAyane, and then Jita and S Makoto. Saren is kind of the flex spot where, depending on which boss it is, a different unit resides. And there's also the option of having mages, but that's not really viable since there's a very large difference between the overflow we get from physical versus mages. So let's take a look at a video of the comp in action. This is on Bilibili, just Sora's version of the timeline, which I think almost everyone went with in the end. There's not really much to say there, it's just the optimal way of playing it, where it's normal timeline at the beginning and then during the middle XChika gets tank swapped to the front. Since after ramping up there's no real need to have S Makoto accelerated with damage, so instead it's just better to have XChika in front for better timings and better uptime on her buffs. And one thing you can see there, XAyane self crits do play a role, because depending on what she does, you may have to adjust slightly since she can get better timings if she crits herself. And just as well, there may be some min-maxes required for some bosses for her to not kill herself on a self crit at certain points, but that's something you could potentially not worry about since there's are all one-shots. But yeah, just something that can be a thing. So 28-second kill here. As for auto comps, I'm not gonna show any in action, but as you can see, there's a ton of different mage comps and phys comps. Just a lot of choice to go with here. Basically anything remotely looking like this is viable. So lots of choice for auto players and not too far behind manual. Alright, then moving on to A2, there is only one manual comp listed on the CN sheet. There's other viable options, but it is kind of what the public has to available for easily finding. So that's what I'll show, because it's also just the best comp we could find in the lab. So let's take a look here. It's just a very standard mage comp, but interestingly with Anne in front and no Luna. So we are at the point where there's enough mages that we can use optimal ones depending on which boss it is, which phase it is, and what we need. And in this case we really need buffs and not as much TP acceleration from Luna. So yeah, also this should be an easy one pun. depending on how Chika crits, it can vary for a couple seconds, but overall it seemed pretty stable thanks to high crit rate. So unless you are missing Chika crits, should get a nice overflow every time. And most clans will probably rule quite a couple of them since it's right at the beginning of the day and basically anyone can run this. Okay, and A2 auto comps. As you can see here, it's a bit different from A1, where we can't actually one pun with full auto, but the manual comp on full auto does very good damage, and it's a basically free full scam when two people do this. This comp is reusable elsewhere, so pretty simple meta. And yeah, again, lots of viable comps, but probably you should be aiming for a full scam, at least for the first one of the day. As for A3, there's 2 comps posted here, although I'm not sure whether anyone should be using this one. It's not really that great when compared to this one, because it's almost 1 million damage difference, and the units here, you kind of change Shiori for Eriko, but for the A1, that's not really such a huge gain that it's worth it. So yeah, kind of just depends on what you're doing, I suppose. For now, I'll just show off this one. So kind of very similar to the A1 comp, except obviously we have regular Chrissy instead of X Chrissy, and you cancel the overlay right here. Kind of interesting how it works. Mushishu is one of my favorite bosses, by the way. Just straight up high damage on the first couple units, and you can deal a lot of damage in return. No stupid bullshit mechanics, just fun and lots of spam. Also notice the difference between Ayane and Eriko damage in terms of UB. Critting with Ayane, it's almost 400k, whereas Eriko UB is consistently above 200k, but can't reach 400k even with full crits. So here, 278k. Not quite as much as that juicy 399k Ayane crit. And which also goes to show why we are using Ayane this excessively this CB. Just insane damage output. But still, Eriko does a lot of damage. A3 auto comps then, kind of the same thing as above. The manual teams can also be ordered, except this Shiori team does a little bit more on full auto than the manual team, which significantly falls off because it has Eriko, and Shiori is just much more friendly towards auto. Interestingly enough, HMimi helps this team quite a bit, and since it replaces Ayane with Eriko in terms of positioning, and so Eriko gets some nicer timings. So yeah, lots of choices here. Just make sure to try it out first, since some of those are semi-auto instead of full auto. And again, we can use mages here, but it's just not quite as good as physical. Alright, a 4 time, and this one's a bit weird because this timeline right here, which is supposed to do 8 million, is... nah, it doesn't really function as advertised. So for the most part, it's gonna be this comp, which again, X Chrissy and Ayane. So a bit costly, but still, yeah, that's just what it takes to deal the most amount of damage possible. Although I suppose you could kind of sub it with this one, but yeah, not the greatest. Most likely for these kinds of teams, you just either want the perfect match for accounts that have both XChika and XAyane to have double fizz with just some other compatible fizz comp, or you just say, yeah, we'll run it in a double mage road and borrow whichever one is missing. So yeah, that's just how it goes if you want a maximum amount of damage, because as you can see, there's a very large drop off with any substitute mate, since these comps are pretty finicky at this point. Looking at it right here, over in the video, you can see this one is actually very similar to A1, since the only difference is that S Tamaki gets added and S Makoto is replaced by regular Makoto, just to have Shred work out better. XChika is tank swapped right at the beginning, and S Tama works to keep the boss from using UB at all, because Master Senri here has a mechanic where on UB he summons adds, namely these small tanuki that go invulnerable immediately. So for CB this means you basically have to instantly clean them up, or your damage is gonna tank, because you can't get through them until they come back out of invulnerability. So yeah, very normal comp. As you can see, lots of 2xing and spamming, because most of the timings really are pretty easy to do. Nice spam at the end. Get all the last buffs. In terms of auto comps, there's one thing in particular. Every time, S Tama for physical, just because she keeps the boss from UBing at all. Other than that, most of the good teams have Makoto instead of S Makoto, because the Shred lines up better even on auto. But yeah, double Makoto is possible, but not really worth it. Just generally very similar comps as the manual, but slightly different, because for auto this is one of those cases where you want Kaori and perhaps Muimi, but yeah, overall still very straightforward boss and lots of options there. Again, there's some options for mages, but not really particularly great, because for mages there's not the kind of TP drain option that S Tama provides. So the boss is gonna UB at some point and you're gonna get the Tanuki, which also means that on full auto it's not gonna be as nice, since it's very hard to make damage landing a line up with the boss UB so that the Tanuki get killed immediately. So now we're at A5, and the goal here, at least for high clans, is just this comp where you two-shot it and get a nice overflow, but like T25, T50 clans can aim for just doing something like this, where you get 2 hits in and then full scam it with a third, which doesn't lose that much damage, but it's just not as efficient and does in the end lose you out on some overflow, which can be used efficiently elsewhere. One quick correction here, at the very top we may use one single hit of this main A5 comp and finish it up with overflows for a full scam, using effectively only one hit. So let's look at the video for this comp, and it's Algedi, so annoying silence to deal with. At least for phase 1 it's not too long, but still kind of just not a nice mechanic, to say the least, because it just screws up the cycle of certain units. But in this case with XChika, it doesn't really bother her too much, and she can still do her role as DPS and buffer at the same time. Yeah, again, just a very standard comp for physical, which coincidentally we're not actually gonna see for quite a while, since after this CB there's gonna be Nyaru, and after that physical landscape changes once again with Twinklewish 6-star. Yeah, moving on to B1 then. this is actually positively affected by having unnerfed Goblin, because XQC taking just a little bit more damage means she works very nicely at 4-star and also does a little bit more damage than the timeline would do against the nerfed Goblin. So that's a nice surprise to have there. There's 3 main options: proper optimal mages, then suboptimal mages for if there's some issue with no Luna, or like, yeah, basically no Luna and no ability to burrow XChika, because this comp is very nice for allocations since you can run double mage modes with this very easily. So ideally you do want to have this as your comp here, because this is much harder to fit into allocations as a double mage route, at least in my opinion. And this one obviously won't work for global because we can't use Kana, but there's other physical teams probably that work. It's just that this best mage team is really nice for using if you have optimal boxes, so you can run double mages. Yeah, let's take a look. As you can see, a very simple timeline, not much to say here. The player is even using 2x for most of this. It's also very similar to the nerfed C1 XChika timeline, where it's basically all spam and maybe 1 or 2 manual timings. Although what you might notice in this case, they're using 5-star Luna, which isn't really a good idea to do. CN just done some next level stuff here. But yeah, this timeline works perfectly fine, and we even save some DA because XChika doesn't need to have 5 stars here. For auto comps, again, lots of variety and still pretty easy kill, although these fizz comps you'll have to try out, because due to having unnerfed goblins, fizz teams do slightly worse because they're affected by the higher PDEF from the boss UB. So be aware of that, make sure you trial first so that you can actually get a one-shot if you're going for that, but mage comps just work perfectly fine, so not much to worry about here. These should all be perfectly usable and get some nice overflow. B2, like A2, has only one comp listed. It's 7.79 mil on CN. A2, B2 and C2 are slightly different on global, which is most notably on C2, where the TP boost difference means the boss UBs are different in a way where timelines just don't align as well. But yeah, for this one, let's take a look. Just a very standard mage comp here. If you've been paying attention, this is completely compatible with the B1 mage team. So very nice for pairing those up in that double mage road. And yeah, it's variety, so we're abusing the damage on the back 2 units as per usual. Nicely buffing up Chika for the big damage, and just hoping that the Ice Lance crits, because with enough Ice Lance crits and some decent luck on all the other hits, she can help us one-shot this boss pretty nicely, as you can see. As for auto, basically anything goes, unless you're running for a full scam where there's only a couple viable comps like this one I've highlighted here. And in terms of mages, there's a lot more viable comps, but yeah, B2, lots of variety, not a too complicated boss, and Tiawi can be used as well because of her position. I kind of like this comp here, even though it's absolutely terrible in terms of damage. It's just really fun to see Tiawi and Eriko in the back 2 spots. But yeah, most likely this is a place for a cheap mage team that can still full scam. Now moving on to B3, again, we have one of these standard physical comps here as the optimal team, and 2 others as options in case you're not using that, although I'm entirely unconvinced this one is any better for allocation or box ease than the optimal comp, so I don't really get why anyone would want to use that. So anyway, let's take a look. It's kind of the same comp once again in action. Getting Shred going, Makoto after her buff, Jida, and then we go off Exquisite first UB, so she starts buffing, gets closer to her stronger second UB. And yeah, Mushishu is just not a terribly difficult boss to play. As you might have seen before, Ayana had UB up for a long time. If you have an adjust for possible self-crits, you can gain extra UBs here and do some nice extra damage. Yeah, nothing too special yet, but just a nice boss to hit. Auto on B3 gets kinda gapped by manual, unless it's this exact comp over here. But still, as long as you accept some damage losses, there's a nice variety here. You can even use mages with this comp right here, which is kind of cool. Although do be aware, unless you have 5-star Exilia with rank 14, this isn't gonna work too well on full auto, so you gotta do semi-auto. And yeah, overall, for auto, not the nicest place to use Kaori, but yeah, not much to say here. Again, not the most interesting boss. It's very smooth to play, but on auto that doesn't really matter anyway. B4 then. So if you look at just the damage numbers, there's the choice between this mage comp and this physical comp here. It's also noticeable that the S-Tama comp does a lot less damage than the other physical comps that are available. Having H-Mimi to UB immediately after the boss and kill the Tanuki is just a better option instead. Also take note, this comp over here only works well with 4-star and less S-Makoto, which every clan should have anyway, because for phase 3 you do need 3-star S-Makoto to run the optimal comps. But yeah, there's other options here, but most likely if you don't have this available, it's probably time to use these mages or just cope on low physical damage, because this mage comp is extremely variable in terms of what it can do, because this ranges up to 7.8 mil, which is a bit higher than physical, but can go down very low. So yeah, if you are running this, prepare for some pain, because either it's gonna work and you're gonna have a grand old time, or it's just gonna collapse and there's not much damage coming out. Where at that point it's probably better to just run with physical and spare yourself the humiliation of resolving a low hit. But yeah, let's take a look at both comps. It should look very familiar, since it's kind of a comp from last CB, or very similar to comps used during last CB. Just a nice typical shred, DPS and support. And here we're starting to set up, because the boss is going to be at the very end once. Which actually, correction, you can probably stop the boss from UBing, but it's not worth it, I presume, looking at this. Yeah, that's 1 UB. Immediately kill the 1 Tanuki that spawns at the beginning and use all the other UB. There's a second Tanuki spawning, but it won't spawn in time before the end. So, yeah, kind of interesting. Now, moving on to the other one, which are the mages. And I won't get tired of XChika UB. It's just really sad she gets immediately displaced by Nyaru next CB, because that UB just looks sick as fuck. As we can see here, for the mages we use Anna to get rid of the Tanuki. So yeah, unfortunately this varies wildly in terms of EV, otherwise a high roll would be very nice to run. And there we go. Once again, auto comps, there's a lot of choice, and for this one most of them are actually full auto, so no weird stuff going on here. Although the really good ones do require some really good units. For example, looking at this one, it's one with Xayane, Xkrisi, Jita and S Makoto, so pretty expensive comp to run. But yeah, there's plenty of choice, and if you're playing auto, there shouldn't be too many issues with sacrificing some damage here to make it fit for your application. And one interesting thing of note here, this comp on semi-auto does quite a lot of damage. I'm not sure whether it works on full auto, but on semi-auto it seems to be pretty good. Now looking at the last boss for phase 2. There's again a clear winner in terms of damage here. And it's this comp, which also appears unfortunately to be the only comp that can actually two-shot this boss. Which is going to be a challenge, because obviously at the top we are going to try to two-shot this boss, and it's not too easy to get that every lap, but it's probably going to be required to stay on top. But if you aren't going for that, then it's perfectly fine to run something like this, where you just two-hit and full scam. Although, yeah, this one depends on which comps you find to work actually and which ones to fit into allocation and boxes. So, probably what I assume a lot of clans are going to do is just pick one of these comps down here and pair it with one of these and full scam like that. Or just roll a bunch of these until you get enough good hits to full scam off 2 hits here and a third. So yeah, just depends on what each clan decides to go with and what they have to work with to get to the goal. Let's look at a video of the main comp. It one's actually pretty difficult at times, so no more free wins here. Again, as we can see, after the first one, the silence just goes on Xkrisi. And also Xayane self-crits do have some impact, since she can go on different routes if she self-crits and gets earlier UB timings. pay attention to the last UB here, or last round of UBs. Just nice Jita spam, XChika spam, and S-Macro unfortunately is silenced there. Auto once again getting gapped quite a bit unfortunately, but what's nice is that at least the good comps are almost all full auto compatible, so no need to worry there. And yeah, lots of fizz options with some clear winners, and in terms of majors there's some options as well. Again with XChika, because she just works really well. One for the XChika lovers, and yeah, nothing too special. This comp down here, be aware this is semi-auto, and Luna does do some shenanigans from time to time there, which is also seen in this 6 million to 7 million damage EV. So quite the fluctuation there. Now we've reached phase 3 and it gets kind of interesting. As mentioned previously, C1 is very different on global, whereas A1 and B1 you didn't really notice much difference, but for C1 it completely invalidates this comp right here, and this comp right here does a lot less damage. So what I've prepared here is the comp that everyone should already know. It's the same one that almost everyone was using against Goblin the last couple times it happened, and as before, it's a pretty significantly consistent full scam. So for us, it's probably impossible to get a consistent one pun, and perhaps there are some comps that are more consistent in terms of getting a full scam, but this one works. It's very easy to play, and overall just a nice comp that people are already comfortable with. So personally I think this is just what we will go with in KC, and yeah, just what I expect most people to use just for ease of use and consistency. So let's let this play out the rest of the way. Although obviously this is quite a couple CBs ago, and we can expect to deal, I think, maybe 6.1 million damage or so consistently. So well into the range where there's no danger anymore of minor screw-ups leading to not getting a full scam. Instead we can probably fix any mistakes even with bad rules on the next boss. C1 order then, it's kind of hard to tell which ones of these work and which ones won't. I'm sure most of the auto players are already pretty comfortable with figuring that out during CB though, and I know most of the auto guys in the lab are well prepared for this boss, and there should be some comps at least with semi-auto that allow you to full scam, probably, at least I think so. There's plenty of options, most of them just use Kokoro for sustain, but Vishizu as well works just fine. It just depends on which front units you're using, especially the tanking unit, because with the higher damage output it's kind of tricky to make sure she always stays alive on full auto. So yeah, auto players, hope you're prepared to trial quite a couple comps until you find one you're happy with that works consistently. Now we're moving on to B2, and this one, unlike C1, isn't different because of a mistake that Crunchyroll made. This is just an inherent difference where CN had slightly different stats, mainly TP boost. So for us, the UBs from the boss will come slightly later than on CN, which means the timelines change slightly. What changes them even more though is the Nanika bug, which is still present on global. Thank the heavens for that one, because otherwise we would have to use a double loop in the CB, which isn't all too fun. But yeah, it also means that this comp right up here will not be able to consistently full scam the boss, because on CN they were able to, with some rolls, get a full scam pretty consistently, especially when using overflow from C1, which we aren't getting actually, because C1 is a full scam for us instead of a kill most likely. So what's gonna happen? Now on to my favorite boss. Phase 3 Mushishu, no bullshit, no weird mechanics, just straight up damage to your front 2 units and some AoE on the UB, and you can reach some pretty insane damage with the physical comp here. And it's also a very cool timeline, but first of all, let's look at all these comps. There's quite a lot here. All that's necessary to hit this boss is having the front unit survive, and thanks to all the support we have at this point and all the lifesteal units can do, there's quite the selection. However, one comp obviously arises far above everyone else, and that's this comp specifically with 3-star S Makoto and 4-star XChika. There's no real replacement for 3-star S Makoto, which is one of the main reasons that it's very important to keep one until this CP specifically. There are 5-star versions, but they are basically not worth using over some of the other comps because it's not really workable. Like having 3-star S Makoto timings is pretty crucial for this comp, where you tank swap XChika in front of S Makoto, and so S Makoto 3-star can still shred properly with the reduced TP gain from damage, but 5-star has some issues there, or can't even properly tank swap XChika in the first place. The alternative option probably is going to be this one, at least that's what I've heard from those who don't have access to 5-star S Makoto. But there's other options as well for people who can take the damage loss. So let's take a look. There's the one I've also worked on, and it's just a very nice timeline in that most of the timings are pure spam, but there's a few tight timings that allow for skill expression because they don't really kill the run usually, and there's options for, well, where they don't really kill the run if you fail them, or like you can preemptively fail them by doing them early or intentionally late, but you do lose a lot of EV because you miss out on some skills or auto attacks hitting. So just a very cool timeline in general, right up my alley, where you buff up, have just a couple DPS and deal a lot of damage. Yeah, as you can see, lots of TP boosts here. We have Vishizu and XChika both boosting TP, and then also Vishizu charging TP alongside Jita. So many rapid fire UBs, and XChika changing forms almost every 10 seconds here with all the incoming damage. There we go, almost 500k damage on that UB, just showcasing how insane XChika's damage output is. Coming almost to finish here. XChika, then S Makoto, getting charged by Vishizu and then Jita. And now just one last round of UBs. And there we go. Really looking forward to playing this. Hope you'll have fun with this as well. For the other comp, we've got this one here. I'm not going to go too deep into this, just showing it off a little bit. So it's double Makoto, no special requirements there. You actually want 5-star XChika for this one, so make sure that if you're using this one, you make people aware of the specific requirements for this, so that they don't accidentally recur for this, because 4-star wants different gear than 5-star. But yeah, very nice timeline overall, just shred a lot, deal a lot of damage, lifesteal a lot, all that good stuff. Auto for C3 is kind of interesting because there's a lot of variation in what you can use, and there's some units showing up here that you don't always see, especially in very good comps. So we've got the Chika option here. Most likely this is just what most people will go with because it works on full auto, and you can also semi-auto it for some extra damage. And yeah, in general this boss not too forgiving for auto play. You do lose a lot of damage compared to the optimal manual comp, but there's some interesting stuff you can do. For example, this comp here it looks very good at first glance, but keep in mind this actually kind of requires 3-star as Makoto, 4-star XChika, and then R9 as Saren and Vishizu. I think this is one of the only times I've actually seen Vishizu R9 being required. So if you have that, then good on you, but otherwise this is kind of a very niche comp. And yeah, mages aren't really too good on this one. Like XChika does benefit from the fact that she takes a lot of damage and goes to low HP, but it's just very difficult to balance that with keeping her alive. So I don't really recommend this stuff unless you're really into using XChika. This is just one of the typical fizz bosses where you fire and forget one comp. Alright, C4. And this is where we see the most difference just due to Neneka bug. This is a loop boss, and it's the only boss we can loop this CB on global, at least unless you have an Icebox Neneka on very specific accounts, which I don't think anyone actually has. So yeah, taking inspiration from Zen is very nice because, for example, this comp right here works perfectly fine, has a nice simple initiation, although we won't be able to do the half punch Zen did. So after you get 56 seconds or more overflow, you can kill a second time just with the overflow. This 58-second timeline is actually just insane because you can very easily kill the boss 2 times with 1 hit effectively. We won't be able to do that on global. We do lose some time on each hit, but we can still get close enough in that we do like a 2 for 3, as in 2 hits to kill 3 bosses, or even better than that. There's lots of options. The double Chika version is best in my opinion, but there's also SIO, which people should be used to already. This one with regular Maho, I don't think it works. This one with S Maho definitely works. It's especially good if you have a lot of bricked units, because it can be made to work with a lot of different stuff. But in general, Lu is just the perfect unit to use here, because the Master Senri summons 2 Tanuki on each UB. They're kind of staggered, so you have 1 and then after a short delay a second one, but if you leave them alive for long enough they go into invulnerability, and we do not want that. So what Lu does is she just kills the Tanuki immediately. Most of the time it's gonna be 1 Tanuki from a previous UB, the second one that's summoned, and 1 from the current UB of the boss. So she kills 2 Tanuki, and that fuels her next UB. At the beginning it's just 1 UB per cycle, which is just UBs, and the kill TP from the Tanukis fuels her next UB during the next cycle, but after some TP boost stacks up, she can very easily start double UBing on every second cycle, and even more during the later stages of the loop. So that's why she does a lot of damage, and for that she requires 3 stars. 4 stars doesn't really work as well, 5 stars even less, but R14, R15, R15 is probably just better. She wants the extra M crit, and the TP boost doesn't really matter in this case. As for the other units, it's best to just check out the CN videos, although it's kind of difficult probably for people who don't have experience with Chinese, or especially pre-con Chinese. So I'll go a little bit with each video. Starting off with the double Chika timeline. This one is with an R10 Kokoro. I think 10.6 works just fine, and depending on how high your UE is, she kind of wants different levels of gear equipment, but probably it's just going to be 10.6 and forget about it. As you can see here, 4-star Nenika, 3-star Nenika can be made to work as well. However, she either needs mid-lift 5-star, refine, or Bond 8, neither of which we really want. So yeah. As for the double Chika setup, XChika kind of has the same requirements for every timeline, and it's a little bit complicated. So first of all, the Chika, you can just assume level 113, and with R11 gear, it's just about being able to get the first UB off, and after that you're Gucci. As for XChika, it's quite a bit more difficult, because she has to have a very specific level of tankiness, or in this case squishiness. It's actually one of the lowest builds you can ever find for her, and it's R9, level 70 or 71, and with very specific gear depending on whether you have Bond 5 Chika or Bond 8 Chika, regular Chika that is. So as you can see here, just showcasing the Lu UBs. This is the point where we actually get into double Lu UBs, and sometimes you'll be able to see an interesting mechanic, I'll call it, where Lu uses UB but won't get TP until the Tanuki finish their death animation, which coincidentally keeps playing during other UBs. So it's kind of, you have to stall for time by using other UBs so she gets her TP faster. And once again, this gets quite ridiculous in that she stacks up so much TP boost thanks to Nenika that she can double UB basically every cycle, and at the end even triple UB, but that's not something we can do to the same extent. That loop is starting to come to a finish, and as we can see, just insane levels of Lu UB, and also starting to lag a bit, because one thing that happens is that all these Tanuki corpses do stack up, and so performance is impacted, which means that loops should be as fast as possible, not only because we want to kill early, obviously, but also so we don't have to deal with all that insane lag at the end. And here, famed triple UB, one more cycle, and it's gonna be a kill. There we go. And it's dead. Now moving on from this one, let's take a look at another one. This is with SIO, and we're gonna see this is with R14 Kokoro, and for this one R10 Kokoro can work and R14 just as well. Interestingly enough, she intentionally tank swaps to the front, which normally you wouldn't want to do because she doesn't get the Nenika TP boost, but it makes it very easy to initiate. And from this point on, basically we clean up the Tanuki with SIO to get her started and make sure we can UB fast enough with her. But after that, it's gonna be Lu doing most of the work at the beginning. So yeah, just basic loop stuff, using XChika to keep it going. the heal fairy actually heals her fully, so we only need to UB every second cycle with our healer, which means we can actually kill the Tanuki with Lu instead of having to use SIO to fuel her TP, since she doesn't need to UB every turn. And yeah, not going to get too deep into this. One other thing I'm going to show off is from Korea, because Korea used a different loop mainly, at least in terms of what was publicly posted, and this one really shows the lag. Like, this isn't a buffering issue on my end, this is actually the lag in-game, where this is played by bots. As you can see, killing the Tanuki with SIO, because the main DPS here is Anne, who needs SIO to clear the way before using her own UB. And that's a kill, and as you can see, quite a lot of lag, because they only killed quite right at the end. It's pretty harsh in terms of performance issues. But yeah, at the end it does finish, but it takes quite a long time to actually play all the animations, because the game is just killing itself and trying its best to not die while it's rendering all this. So yeah, hopefully nobody uses this. It's not a good timeline at this point, because Lu just is a lot better than Anne, because you don't have to waste SIOUB to kill the Tanuki, and you can just actually TP feed your DPS, which, looking at another timeline here, is not a loop. This is the timeline most people who aren't looping will probably use, so it's best to show that one off too. And it's a very standard physical comp. Actually, it's quite a nice comp, which wouldn't have made me too sad if we couldn't loop this, because EV on this one is also above 8 million. But, well, we are going to loop it in the end, but those who don't loop don't have to be too sad. At the end of the day, you're going to kill this in 2 hits pretty handily, and it's not too big of a deal unless you're like at the top, so yeah, you'll probably know what you're doing anyway. Auto comps on C4 obviously aren't going to loop, but this comp that's also the main non-loop manual comp works just fine on semi-auto, but in terms of full auto comps, things are looking quite differently, because you do need a proper tank to survive. Otherwise it's just very hard on full auto to make anyone live, because this boss does a lot of damage. Like, the regular auto attack is almost comparable to a Goblin UB, so you can imagine how that's going to be quite a problem for auto. But yeah, Ruka benefits a lot here. She does shred enough on her own that just with Ruka and S Makoto, it's going to be a nice and consistent shred here. But yeah, for mages there's also some options here if you want to use them. In this case this is semi-auto, because you want to use regular Chiaro UB to clear out all the ads, and well, if anyone wants to use IO, I guess knock yourself out. There's an option there. So now we're at the final boss, and it's also where the biggest difference between EN and CN happens, because CN was looping this, and luckily for Global, due to Nanika bug, we won't be able to loop this. And I say luckily because this timeline is abhorrent to play. The initiation is very complicated and difficult, despite what it looks like, and playing the loop it takes a long time. Like, there are not that many rest frames in between each boss UB. So what that means is that there's a lot of boss UB in a very short time frame. Normally we would like that, because it means we get a lot of UB off in a short amount of time. However, with each boss UB, the boss does a debuff. So what that means is the M attack buff on Nenika UB doesn't really stack that high because it's counteracted by the boss UB debuff. So we deal very little damage with each UB and have to UB a lot. And that's not really a recipe for success. Especially on global, where even if we were able to consistently initiate a loop, which we would be able to with a very low level Nenika, then what happens is that at some point every unit's magic attack gets debuffed to 0. So at that point you only deal as much damage as the skill multiplier on that UB does. So not really all that high, and it's not fun to play, especially considering that this is a UB with 1 hit and we still have the crit issue where it can crit with a 1 in 1,000 chance. So since you do a lot of UBs and any crit on most units kills you, this is not a good thing to happen. So yeah, if you get crit at any point you just die. Yeah, just wanted to show this off. We won't be using this on global and I'm very happy about that. There is an article that I'm going to link in the description about this loop in specific, because it was very difficult to find and the people who figured it out are pretty interesting in how they present the findings. If you can read Chinese, I recommend it. It's a pretty good read, just like the article on the one pun for CB19 C5. Looking at the actual comps we are using though, it's mostly physical. However, because we need so many hits on C5 and those who loop on C4 need to spend most of the hits on C5 actually, it's going to be more than 30 hits per day on C5. So what that means, either we have some weird curve with Jun where we use double physical, or the more realistic option is just 1 mage team, 1 physical team. And I think that's gonna work out just fine. So let's look at the main physical team. Let's get rid of this one. So this is Shinobu's last hurrah, so to speak, because Skull Daddy is very useful for tanking this. And one major issue we have with this one is that it has a mechanic where we need to keep it poisoned, and 2, the silence is quite annoying. Not just because of how silence works, but also because of the way it applies, because in this case it deals damage on 1 frame and on the next frame it applies silence. So in the case where you get UB from the damage taken just before the silence, if you spam and miss that 1 frame where damage applies, well, you miss the UB because the unit gets silenced and it's basically over. For most cases this means it's just an ambulance, because if Makoto misses an UB, then yeah, you just die. Units don't lifesteal enough to stay alive. And with DPS, if they lose a UB, you just lose so much EV, it's hard to, well, still reach a reasonable amount of damage afterwards. This is especially noticeable on the last round of UB for this timeline, because that's just, you get UB from the damage caused by the silence, and if you miss spam on the units that are in an animation, you just lose those UBs. And here you can see that in action. Another possible comp is right here. Instead of X Ayane, we are using X Chrissy, and we're also using Muimi. One thing with this boss is that knockback is pretty useful for adjusting the timings of its cycle. So yeah, very cool. basically just forced to be used because of the poison mechanic. But other than that, both timelines function very well, so just pick and choose whichever you need, or whichever is better to fit into allocation and routing. Pick a timeline like this. Pretty quick. Yippee. And there we go. One last round. Tut tut. Let's not forget the mages. This is the mage comp, and I say the because it's the only one I know to actually work. It's just a nice traditional Kyoka Ice Lance crit fish comp, where you giga buff Kyoka and you hope the Ice Lance crits. And if it crits, it's very nice. If it doesn't crit, then you cry. But yeah, not the perfect execution. It's a bit weird to see because you can do a little bit better than this, but perfectly fine for demonstration purposes. Is one of the issues when we can't do what CN does. Like in this case, the alternative comps aren't really researched quite as much as the loops, because the top clans just don't really use these kinds of comps. They were locked into double looping and basically did it as either a platitude towards other clans, or the lower ranked clans themselves had to figure it out. So there's just less interest and manpower devoted to making these ones optimal. And it doesn't help either that this one is pretty tough to play, I think. Like, at least to me, it's quite difficult to play this. But yeah, let's let the player finish, having to reference the timeline quite a bit because of issues arising during the timeline. But at the end of the day, we get an Ice Lance crit, Kyoka UB rolling quite high. And now we see a bit of a better execution, hopefully, where we don't have these silence shenanigans. By the way, intentionally delaying the Escaru UB here. And yeah, it's just playing it out and hoping you hit these one frame spams and difficult timings. There's a lot of them. Nice Kyoka Ice Lance crit. Everyone silenced. UB immediately after silence ends, which lines up quite nicely. 8 Kyoka just in time for the Ice Lance. Another nice hit there. Unfortunately, having to take the debuff from the boss UB, but still good enough damage there. And moving towards the end here, last silence ends. Can get another H Kyoka UB off. Nenika UB after this Kyoka UB, which should probably be the other way around. And yeah, unfortunately missed the last Escaru UB there. As for auto comps, quite simple. As long as you have X Ayane and Jita in your comp, you can just put Jun, Makoto and any other unit basically, and it kind of works. But there's plenty of options available. I like this team, even though it's semi-auto. I'm not sure how well it works on full auto, but on semi-auto it works just fine. But yeah, plenty of options. Again, Ruka being an all-star because we don't have New Year Kokoro yet. She just taunts and shreds, and it's very nice. And for full auto, mages are a viable option, although I think most of these are actually semi-auto. But, oh, actually this one is advertised as actually full auto compatible, so hopefully that works and isn't hampered by an Enika bug. But yeah, again, quite a lot of options. Just pick whichever one works with your box and routing, and it should be fine. In conclusion, for CB22, this is one I've been looking forward to for quite a while, because it is the last CB before Nyaru, and so it's the last hurrah for a lot of cool units that would be really fun to use if unfortunately they didn't get completely pushed out of the meta by Nyaru. So hope everyone can really enjoy it and have lots of fun on this last CV, where we don't just one-shot every single boss with the same unit and cope on our third hits, where we're forced to use physical and cry, as we do less than half as much damage as Nyaru does. But yeah, lots of cool changes to come in the near future. We're still not sure when we will get Pricalc, because some servers got her earlier than others. But regardless of what happens, I'm pretty convinced it's gonna be fine regardless, because at this point I think everyone's just numbed to the CR bullshit that happens regularly, and nothing can surprise anyone anymore. So hope everyone is having a grand old time. Good luck during CB, and fuck CB. And dear leader, hope you understand that I'm gonna ghost because the credits rolled and that means the game is over. So see you after CB. Bye bye.